Hello there and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Russia attacked Ukraine on the 24th of February, but its forces have now fully withdrawn from around the capital Kiev and northern Ukraine to Belarus and Russia. Russian officials have said that the focus of their forces is now the complete liberation of the Donbass, which broadly refers to Ukraine's eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, where Russian-backed separatists held significant territory before this military operation. Today's updates pushed us to ask several questions. Why did Russia move toward the capital at first, while their main goal was the Donbass region from the very beginning? And how will Ukraine fight in the eastern part of the country, where districts over there are mostly pro-Russians? Numerous questions are directed to our panel of guests. We have Mr. Sébastien Perimoni, member of Solidarity and Progress political party from France, and Don McLean-Jail from Philippines, a geopolitical analyst in Pacific region. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in this debate. The show begins right after this break. And before we delve into discussion, let me invite you to follow this report. Russia on Tuesday called on the entire Ukrainian army to lay down their arms, the last defenders of Mariupol, to end their senseless resistance, a call that comes as Moscow seems to have launched what it calls a new phase of its military operation in Ukraine.
In Mariupol, the only few Ukrainian soldiers are now asked to lay down their arms. The Russian forces, while they continue to take control of the city, have made an ultimatum to Ukraine's soldiers to surrender, and they will be safe.
This is our call to the world. This could well be the last call of our lives. We may be living our last days, even our last hours. The enemy is 10 times more numerous than us. It has the advantage in the air, in the artillery, and in its ground forces. In terms of equipment and tanks, we defend only one element, the Azovstal factory, where in addition to military personnel, there are also civilians who are victims of this war.
The Russian Defense Ministry says Russian forces are opening a humanitarian corridor for Ukrainian soldiers to leave Mariupol.
We call on the official authorities in Kiev to be reasonable, to order the fighters to stop the senseless resistance and leave the epicenter of the resistance.
The situation in the southern Ukrainian city is horrific. It will add another page to history books of how war can turn entire cities into nothing. And while civilians in the port city continue to hide in underground shelters, Kiev has announced that a preliminary agreement has been reached with Russia to evacuate nearly 6,000 civilians from Mariupol on Wednesday.
I've been there all the time, until they threw me out. They said to leave and the building was about to blow up. And they threw us out. And so we left.
Last week, more than 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers surrendered in Mariupol, but several hundred others, according to pro-Russian separatists, are still in the huge Azovstal factory.
So, as it seems now, the focus on Mariupol and the eastern part. Mr. Sebastian, before initiating in-depth analysis into the war, would you tell us first how would the current Russian-Ukraine crisis affect the domestic political scene in France and the presidential elections, and how it would affect in general Europe?
First, as a French politician, I have to say that we will have the election on Sunday, the presidential election on Sunday, but we will have a third round, with what we call the legislative election in June. So I have to announce that I am candidate for this election for the French living outside in North Africa and West Africa, which include Algeria. So it's a good news. So I call upon the people who are listening to us to mobilize around my candidacy. So what we will discuss today can be discussed at the National Assembly in June of this year. So of course that the Ukraine war has a big impact on the French presidential election, but what is crucial is not really this Ukraine issue, is more the event that we will have tonight with the big debate between Macron and Marine Le Pen, because we all know that last time Marine Le Pen lost this debate and lose the presidency. So now she said that she is ready to defeat Macron. You will have this debate tonight. And so we will see. It's up to France, to the French population to decide. But what is sure is in terms of the conflict in Ukraine or in Europe, it will be black or white, as the two candidates are totally opposed on this situation. First, you have Marine Le Pen. First, you have Macron, who is totally pro-European Union, federalist, pro-NATO, going with the United States on this war on Ukraine. And you have Marine Le Pen on the other side, who want to leave NATO, and she is more pro-Russian in a sense, and want to discuss with Vladimir Putin to solve the issue. But I think it's clear that this presidential election will be key in Europe, with the winners of this election, either it is Marine or Macron, because it will be a very important choice, and also for the war in Ukraine, as the two candidates has opposite view on this issue. So it is very important, and the debate tonight that everybody can follow on the French national TV is very, very important for the future of France, the future in Europe, and also the future of the Ukraine crisis.
Perfectly understood. Thank you so much for this really important point. Mr. McLean, how can you explain this sudden move toward the eastern part of Ukraine? Has Russia failed, or this was a premeditated scheme to weaken the Ukrainian army and focus on the main goal, in other words, the Donbass region?
Thank you so much for your question, and thank you for having me. Now, we have to understand the recalibration of Russia is a definite result of the realities on the ground. It has suffered significant losses, which we cannot hide, and at the same time, the recalibration seeks to double down on its aim to liberate the Donbass region, which may serve as an alternative buffer against an expansion from NATO. And at the same time, the offensive from the south has been considerable, and it has achieved considerable progress in cutting Ukraine's access to the Sea of Azov. And of course, a major portion of the Black Sea, except areas of resistance such as Mariupol, with intense fighting in some townships for that matter. Now, talking about Mariupol, Russia has clearly outnumbered Ukrainian forces there, despite facing logistical setbacks. And the ceasefire, for that matter, is something that we can see that Russia intends to use to maintain and preserve its forces, its use of force. However, we can see that Zelensky may want to let Russian forces bleed more. And this can be seen as he says that he would not want Ukrainian forces to fight, to back down, as they would want to fight till the end. And this is something that we have to take into consideration. However, as we can see, the Guardian report, for that matter, the Ukrainian forces themselves are seeking for help. The Guardian report has effectively outlined this. And we have to take these into consideration from a moral standpoint, which the Ukrainian president seems to use often to gain support from the West. So really what we are facing is a recalibration of military posturing based on the changes on the realities on the ground.
Perfectly understood. All right, moving on in our discussion, let me highlight this piece of news. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Ukraine did not appreciate the goodwill gesture when the Russian forces were withdrawn from the outskirts of Kiev. Lavrov stressed that the special operation in Ukraine aims to liberate the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics has now begun. It's a new phase, and let's start with that.
Operation in the east of Ukraine is aimed, as was announced from the very beginning, to fully liberate the Donetsk and Lugansk republics. And this operation will continue. It is beginning, another stage of this operation is beginning, and I'm sure this will be a very important moment of this entire special operation.
So, Sebastian, coming back to you, how and based on what did the French president Emmanuel Macron gained the first round of the election against the political rivals Marine Le Pen and Jean Mélenchon, although critics say Macron, as the EU leader, couldn't manage to bring peaceful ending to Ukraine's war or even successful negotiations.
Yes, first of all, we have to say that Macron did not really win the first round of this presidential election, because if you count the vote against him, not only for Marine Le Pen, but also for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was the left-wing opposition, it's more than 40% against Emmanuel Macron. And I want to remember that even Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon are to leave NATO. So we cannot say that Macron win the first round of this election. You have 60% of the French population who vote for candidates who want to leave NATO and not to be submit, to this imperial policy of NATO war against Russia and China. So it's one point, and I don't think, as we say in French, a lot of people think that we don't change a president in time of war. So of course it plays in favor of Macron, as we are at war now, and say we cannot change the president during a war. So it's playing in favor of Macron, but it's not enough to say that he win the first round of the election. So it's very important what will be the result of this election, because if France want to be heard in this conflict, because we have to be truthful, for now Europe has nothing, has realized nothing to succeed in this Ukraine conflict. I want to remember what said, Victoria Nuland during the Obama presidency, when they were bringing to power after the Maidan coup d'etat, when they bringing their friends, with the neo-Nazi party at the head of the Ukraine. She said, sorry for the familiar language, she said, fuck the EU. So exactly what is going on now. So the crisis in Ukraine is a crisis between the United States of America, NATO, which control NATO, and Russia. And for now, the European Union is just following, without any voice saying that we have to leave NATO and have our own policy regarding the question of bringing peace to Europe and negotiate with Russia and Ukraine.
Understood. Mr. McLean, how is and what current happening now is kind of, can we call it a leftover of the WW2, especially when Russia keeps saying that Ukraine's Nazism should be stopped?
Right, thank you. And while some may call it as a leftover of the Second World War, I personally feel that it is more of a leftover of the Cold War merged with recent geopolitical realities, of course. We can see that there were immediate concerns since 1997 between Yeltsin and Clinton on the enlargement of NATO. And in fact, in 2001, President Putin himself wanted to join NATO, and the request was acknowledged by NATO leadership as well. Russia fears, since that particular moment, of being excluded from the European security architecture. However, as we all know, the role of spheres of influence and the geostrategic value of Europe has complicated the situation further. As my respected co-panelist has mentioned, it has become certain that it is between Russia, the US, and NATO. And key US strategists and thinkers, such as Dr. Kissinger, Professor Mearsheimer, have been talking about the current predicament several years ago. Russia's aggression towards a sovereign state like Ukraine shows that the realpolitik nature of the international system, such as that from the Cold War, has not vanquished in contrast to what scholars and academics have said. Rather, it is getting stronger by the day. And a solution, of course, must be crafted based on this knowledge with this particular scenario in mind.
Sorry to cut your train of thought, Mr. McLean, but to share a point with Mr. Sebastian, in Asia, which candidates probably they support in the France presidency, the elections in France? I mean, here in Africa, people may look for Mélenchon because he is very good with the refugees and the people from around all the continents. On the other side, they are not with Macron because he is an EU leader, and with Marine Le Pen because she is kind of extremist. I mean, in Asia, which president they may support?
You mean the African population?
Yes.
Oh, it's difficult. They should support us, not Mélenchon or Macron or Marine Le Pen. Anyway, because you talk about Mélenchon, take the case of Mélenchon, you know, although we can say that he wants to take refugees, you know, he's very nice, he wants to open the borders, but he's not what African people are expecting, you know. He is not against the franc CFA, you know, this colonial currency that it is imposed since the Second World War. You have 14 countries in Africa still today under the currency, the franc CFA, controlled by France. And you know, these 14 countries in Africa, in West Africa, are in the 30 countries the poorest in the world. So it means that this franc CFA have maintained since the Second World War 14 countries of Africa, more than 200 million people under extreme poverty. That's the case today. And I never heard Mélenchon, nor Macron, neither Marine Le Pen say that we have to stop this, let's say, economist slavery colonialism, you know. It's like, yes, it's economical colonialism. So I have not heard any candidate discuss about that. And so if we are sovereignists for France, we have to be sovereignists for also the other countries of the world, which is not the case of the candidate in France. So that's a big problem. And second point, you know, African country wants to develop. They want infrastructure, they want water, they want energy, they want everything we avoid them to have. So no candidate in France are proposing that except my candidacy. So I think it's worth to look at it and be sure that what Africa is expecting is the future of their continent.
Perfectly understood. Africa is always looking for a better solution. At a meeting with the top military brass, Russia's defense minister Sergei Shoigu has accused the US and other Western nations of supplying Ukraine with weapons so that it continue fighting until the last Ukrainian.
The Russian army is fulfilling the tasks set by the commander-in-chief in the course of the special military operation. The plan to fully liberate the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics is being consistently implemented, and measures are being taken to establish a peaceful life. The Russian servicemen participating in the operation show courage and heroism in the fulfillment of their military duty. The United States and Western countries are doing everything to drag out this special military operation as much as possible. The growing supplies of foreign weapons clearly signal their intention to provoke the Kyiv regime to keep fighting until the last Ukrainian.
Mr. McLean, is what Russian officials claim true, or this is just a justification of failure since they couldn't reach the capital Kiev? And how could the US manage to make this war profitable for its interest?
Right. So we have to understand that the war in itself is definitely an area of profit for defense manufacturers. As we can see, major manufacturers, for that matter, have been increasing their profits because of this particular situation. However, we can also see that, of course, there are several complicated factors involved. Perhaps we could talk about the situation and the possibility of expanding NATO membership to Finland and Sweden, for that matter, will also add further complications to the situation at hand. So we have to take these factors into consideration in order to create an objective analysis of what is really happening throughout the situation.
Ukraine has received fighter jets and spare parts to strengthen its air force, said Pentagon spokesman John Kirby, declining to specify the number of the countries that provided the aircraft. Kirby also did not specify the type of aircraft supplied to Ukrainian army, which had been asking for war plans for weeks, but he implied they were Russian-made aircraft.
I would just say, without getting into what other nations are providing, that they have received additional platforms and parts to be able to to be able to increase their fleet size. They have received additional aircraft and aircraft parts to help them, get more aircraft in the air. I would say we certainly have helped with the transshipment of some additional spare parts that have helped with their aircraft needs, but we have not transported whole aircraft. I'm careful not to detail battlefield tactics here because we're not on the ground, and so our visibility is, quite frankly, somewhat limited.
More weapons is clearly going to upset Russia. Mr. Sebastian, how do you think this latter will react, Russia, toward these weapons always to Ukraine? And how is Europe going to deal with Putin's demand to pay gas and Russian oil by rubles?
The only alternative we have today, we have to think of the future, The only alternative to this war, is internal cooperation. And we should not accept to have this conflict going on in Europe between NATO and Russia. Otherwise, it will be chaos for everybody. So no country will be able, in the world today, no country will be able to be independent or live by itself. So I think the good news in that, because maybe we can see a good news, is that this crisis will allow us to reorganize the world financial and monetary system, which is, in any case, is in bankrupt in Europe, in the Occidental world, and put an end to the hegemony of the dollar. So I think we have seen the Indian and the Russian signing a deal, to have an exchange in rubles. I think it's the future of the world monetary and financial system, but I think nobody will be able to survive alone in terms of energy policy and gas and so on and so forth, independently without working with Russia today. So I think it's a big dilemma, but we have to see the solution before and then fight for it.
Mr. McLean, this war pushed all European countries toward the Asian countries for an alternative over the Russian gas and energy, and even Russia is creating an alliance with major powers over that, such as China, India. So, to this point, do you think Asian countries will be leading and leaning toward the Eastern Pole in what seems to be a new bipolar world order?
Thank you so much for the question. And first, we have to underscore that we are entering, in fact, towards a multipolar order because of the rising powers, particularly in Asia as well. And this is beyond the traditional perspective of the unipolar moment of American hegemony or the bipolar moment. In fact, there are significant increases when it comes to the hierarchy of power in the international system. Now, if we talk about Asia for that matter, Asian countries have shown their political maturity and offer new potentials, particularly for European countries who are facing material decline. And we have to understand, you talked about the Asian position vis-a-vis the Ukraine-Russia war, but we have to look into what has led to this particular balanced approach. Now, economically speaking, greater economic troubles for countries are faced that are indebted to international financial institutions or part of the Chinese debt trap, for that matter, we have seen in South Asia with Pakistan, with Sri Lanka ongoing. And the sanctions applied on Russia have significant impacts on them as well, these developing countries in Asia. And on top of that, this has led to calls for self-reliance and potentially de-dollarization, as my co-panelist has also mentioned. And if we look into the security architecture, of course, just a brief point, while many critics continue to label the response of Asian countries as weak, particularly because most of them do not want to slap sanctions on Russia, we have to understand it objectively. Understanding, of course, the region is important to know the ongoing predicaments that these countries face individually.
Understood. In a meeting in the Russian capital, Moscow, the Russian President Vladimir Putin and Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan hailed the process of normalizing relations between Turkey and Armenia. Turkey and Armenia have had no diplomatic or commercial relations for 30 years. Talks are the first attempt to restore links since 2009 peace accords. The two leaders also expressed their support for the implementation of the agreement signed between Russia, Armenia and Azerbaijan. Mr. Sebastian, majority of politicians all over the world are assuming that Putin's career has been damaged as a president, whether he succeeded to reach his goals or not. In this military operation, but in the same line of thought, Putin is still showing more experience as a king of politics since he's about to solve one of the historic conflicts, Armenia and Turkey. How can you read this?
Yes, first I want to make a point. I totally agree with what was saying by the other participants about the will of the US who wants this war to continue as long as it's possible, and especially the military industrial complex. And I want to mention that you will have a big event, in Madrid in June, which is called Global NATO 2030. And it's a very big event organized by NATO, which will become, as it say, and it will be presented like this, to oppose Russia and China's threat in the 10 next years. And NATO is going global and saying that they will be the military forces of the world financial empire against Russia and China. So of course they want this war to continue as long as they can. So that's one point I wanted to make for the image or the career of Putin. It's quite funny because of course making war is never good for your image, but I think the return of the Russian diplomacy in the world is crucial today, and it's very, very important, as we have seen in Syria, for example, to stop the regime change policy of the US starting in 2001 against Afghanistan, against Iraq, against Syria, against Libya, and it has to stop. And the return of the Russian diplomacy in the middle of this fundamental issue for peace and war in the world is very important. So I think it was said also by the other participants, we are now in a multipolar world. So the end of the American hegemony is over. And
Perfect.
We have to think, like this. So I don't think that the career of Putin is damaged at all by what is going on in Ukraine today.
Understood. Mr. McLean, do you agree or disagree with what Mr. Sebastian has just mentioned, saying that his career is not yet being damaged? He is doing great and the diplomacy failed. 2 minutes left.
Yes, thank you. And in fact, I agree with Mr. Sebastian on the points that he has made for this particular matter, because as we can see, going back to my point, if we look into the situation in Southeast Asia and South Asia, these countries are also wary of putting all their eggs in one basket, considering that they have external and internal constraints. And if we look into other particular factors, public opinion, many, in fact, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and West Asia are also wary about the double standards, particularly that we can see what is happening throughout the Middle East because of Western involvement, and of course in Afghanistan recently happening, and it is continuously ongoing for that particular matter, and the destruction on human life is something that they are wary about. So these countries, particularly in Asia, are creating balanced steps in order to address the situation peacefully. They have advocated for peaceful negotiations, as this will be a long-lasting solution, rather than supplying more weapons at the expense of Ukrainian lives. And this will not only damage the credibility of Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, but it will also spill over throughout the world, and it would be catastrophic. So yes, I do agree with Mr. Sebastian on this.
Quite understood. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us in the show. Mr. Sebastian, Mr. McLean, thank you so much for your presence. I really do appreciate it. To this end, ladies and gentlemen, we reached the point for this coverage. A special coverage will be held tomorrow. For now, have a blessed evening and bye-bye.